Okay, so welcome to this Technology Leaders Club interview following a recent dinner. I'm joined by Justin Kuruvilla. Justin, please can you tell me a little bit about yourself and who you work for?
Hi, Dominic. My name is Justin Kuruvilla. I'm the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at RiskLedger. You can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here, but I'm based in London with the company. I've come here after a long career in government service, working for the DoD in cybersecurity operations. At RiskLedger, my role is sort of broad-ranging, both internally and externally, where we focus on cybersecurity issues, as well as working with our clients from an external perspective on helping them to maximize their understanding and identification of supply chain risks that they've uncovered through our platform.
We're speaking on the back of an event that was hosted a few days ago in London. It was titled DORA is Here, What Financial Firms Can Do Now and Achieving Resilience Beyond Compliance. So perhaps you could explain a little bit about why that title and why the topic is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think DORA, like other regulations, affecting whether it's critical national infrastructure or public sector, clearly there's a strong recognition of the threat that supply chain attacks can pose. And these are efforts by various regulators to try to really sort of enhance the sectoral resilience of this. And so, of course, cheekily asking the question if anyone's not compliant with DORA, nobody answered in the affirmative at the dinner, right? Because, like with anything, mature organizations are really going to put in a good faith effort to comply. So, what I mean by resilience beyond compliance, right? Whether it's security, it's resilience. We know you can't just do a tick box approach to security. You can't just fill out a check sheet, tick all the boxes, and say I'm all green, I'm secure. But really, more importantly, is does your organization have a mature management of cyber risk? And does that span across from the top level, right? Is there board buy-in? Is there strong governance? All the way down to deep technical controls. So much in the same way of complying with specific requirements of DORA, that'll naturally improve your resiliency, especially if you're an organization that maybe isn't as quite mature as some of your peers. But what we mean by achieving resilience beyond that is going beyond the tick box approach, going beyond the bare minimums asked of the regulation. And so, what can that do in terms of taking a proactive approach to helping shed a light on previous risks that you hadn't identified in supply chain? And for my background in the government, we call that, it's sort of a cliche phrase, but we call it the unknown unknowns. And how can understanding what these unknown unknowns do to impact and improve your resiliency and security planning?
The session itself looks a number of points, and you may have touched on this a little bit already, which was how does DORA reshape sort of third party risk management and impact the way that financial firms in particular secure their digital supply chain. So how did the delegates, how did the attendees respond to that point?
Well, the interesting thing about DORA and other similar regulations is that it's affecting literally the T in third party risk management, right? It's not just the third parties. It's, yes, there's a clear recognition of the fact that concentration risks exist across the supply chain. And those are your third parties themselves. So the fourth parties, fifth parties, all the way down to the nth parties. And some of the guests at the event were tracking these fourth parties and have created internal working groups anyway to start looking at fourth party and beyond risks. But of course, there was general agreement that there's still much to be done and a lot that should be done at a much higher level, at a level where there's visibility across the entire sector. And there was, a lot of thoughts and views that this should be done by the regulators. It was acknowledged that the regulators, the European supervisory authorities, they're collecting everyone's registries of informations to then identify for each entity what are all the different financial functions that are being provided by suppliers, and then mapping all this together at that level. And that's great. But what I challenged was that, is there a way to get ahead of that? Can you proactively try to get this information themselves rather than putting this information in the hands of the regulators and waiting for them to come back at some unknown time in the future? Because the threats do exist today. And the threats aren't going to go away and come back 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whenever the regulators come back to say, right, we've looked at everyone's information, we've identified the concentration risks. So by doing this and taking a proactive approach to really understanding what these risks are, right? Perhaps there's a supplier who maybe is more dependent by your peers than you thought they were, or perhaps there's dependencies that exist beyond the visibility that you have that you hadn't thought about. So, for example, if you have a critical third party and your backup plan is to depend on a different third party should they go down. What if those two third parties depend on the same fourth party, right? So shedding a light into this and having this sort of additional context can really help change the way you've approached operational resilience and your security in general. Um, and having that information is only better to be able to understand this. And it's better to do that proactively rather than just wait until you're told later, hey, you have these dependencies. Can you do something about this?
And next, you turn to some sort of practical steps that firms can take to address compliance gaps and meet those DORA requirements effectively. Were there sort of common approaches? Again, you've probably touched on this a little bit, but there are kind of common approaches that organizations were taking there.
Yeah, what was actually good to hear and what I expected was that from a gap perspective, most people were pretty on point with Dora, right? They again, they sort of looked at it from a perspective of how did they comply with this, and again, no one was necessarily uncompliant. Of course, different organizations have different deadlines, and that's based on the member states in which they operate and those regulators looking to determine the different deadlines for receiving registers of information and so forth. But there seemed to be a good faith effort in terms of all this, and there weren't really concerns in that. Um, However, there were still concerns with the level of effort required to address some of these requirements and the access information that was being asked upon the entities by the regulators. And while many of us sort of generally understand that the financial sector has a much more mature approach to cybersecurity maturity, whether it's the responsibility that they're taking as well as the resource, right? And you can argue that from my interaction with the government, probably the best resource sector compared to the government in terms of time and people to be able to focus on this. However, even within at the event, there was still a wide variety in terms of the number of resources available, and that's stemming from sort of newer upcoming fintechs to more established entities, and the challenges facing based on revenue and costs in doing this. And so that's where there was sort of a gap in terms of the ability to put information or put people towards this, which of course raises the question: if you're spending a lot of time and effort in terms of meeting the requirements, is that being taken away from assessing the current cyber threat landscape and defending against the threats that exist today? Where again, my approach is that collaboration can help with this, and collaboration can help share the burden of third-party risk management.
And finally, delegates looked at how financial organisations can go beyond compliance to achieve kind of longer term operational resilience and stronger supply chain cybersecurity. So, how did that discussion play out?
From my perspective, the biggest way to achieve that is really through collaboration, right? So during my time with the government, we worked with many government allies to share information, right? So, we are stronger together by sharing intelligence and information because everyone has different perspectives, everyone has different views, and is cited on different sort of threats and risk insights. So by sharing that, you have a much more cohesive approach to be able to defend against cyber threats, and you're just sharing knowledge, right? And so sharing is great. And we see this a lot in the threat intelligence space, where regardless of the sector, indicators of compromise, new threats, whether that's information being purchased from commercial feeds or being shared amongst peers, right? That's being done in such a way that's identifying the threats and trying to defend against them without sort of, getting into the issues of competitive advantage and giving away, trade secrets and so forth. So from a third party risk management perspective, collaboration really is the way ahead because we're all doing the same amount of work. Why not share this information, right? There was some challenge to that. I think a lot of folks felt that there was coordination, being done where responses or viewpoints would be coordinated together through trade bodies to provide that as a single source of information back to regulators or interested parties. But that's more coordination, not collaboration, right? And DORA actually tries to address this with information sharing, but it's not mandatory, right? It's there's still concerns generally about competitive advantages and trade issues and commercial sensitivity and stuff. But from our approach, it's how do we get more collaboration without risking your competitive advantages? And I think there's a lot of benefits for that, right? The first benefit is that you are better aware, have better awareness, better sighted on threats, and maybe understand risks that you've identified in some of these shared suppliers, right? Perhaps through one organization's TPRM process, they've identified a certain number of risks that they feel are important that a supplier might have. Perhaps someone else hasn't done that level of granularity and didn't see that, and that's something they can share or also maybe confirm that they too have the same risks. That helps with supplier engagement because if a supplier, a supplier is dealing with thousands of customers, if every one of them is complaining, depending on the source of revenue that this customer provides, and during just as busy as they all are in their own schedules, how much engagement can you actually have with the supplier? But by working together and building sort of a body of evidence and strength in numbers, you can approach this particular supplier and improve any security risks that you've had. If you say, listen, X of us together that can constitute Y percentage of this entire sector, we have these risks that we want to get sort of addressed. And then there's also the force multiplier effect, right? As we talked about, TPRM is a very time intensive and manual process. And even within the financial sector, there's a wide variance of the level of resource that certain entities can have. So if you're collaborating, and again, this isn't to replicate or eliminate due diligence, you're still going to do your due diligence. But if you can leverage on the insights that your peers have performed, insights and work that's been done to assess these suppliers, to understand what the risks that the suppliers have, and perhaps some of these entities have contracts where a third party will provide them fourth party information. Some entities may not have this in their contracts, but we know we want to get to a place where we provide visibility beyond that third party to really shed a light on this. And so again, the collaboration really helps with your ability to enhance and understand the threats, or enhance your ability to do TPRM, understand the threats that maybe exist and may not be aware to you, and then increase your efficiencies. By increasing your efficiencies, now you're assessing more suppliers and getting beyond just filling out the register of information that the European supervisory authorities want, but taking that proactive approach where you can then understand perhaps these are risks that need to be triaged and addressed. Or again, just because it's a risk doesn't actually necessarily mean you have to do anything about it. You might have accepted the risk already. Perhaps reassessing it with new information allows you to sort of look at the risk again. But perhaps for a variety of reasons, whether that's performance, cost, security, you still may choose to accept the risk, or maybe add additional controls to accept the risk. But no one wants to say they didn't know. But having this information that's provided through collaboration really can help you with informed decision making.
A question about risk ledger and how does risk ledger fit into this conversation? You've talked a lot about supply chain there. Um, you know, where does risk ledger fit in with that process?
Risk ledger's approach is a bit different, where in terms of TPRM, I think someone has called us the LinkedIn of TPRM, where it is by building a social network that's based on trust, right? Where you have clients, they're engaged with their suppliers, and they're also engaged with their peers. You now have sort of ground truth where you're not sort of looking through the noise to understand the information that you need, but you have ground truth to actually understand what kind of relationship you have with your suppliers and your peers. And so individually, you can build out this entire supply chain. And suppliers who are on the platform, who themselves have built out their supply chain, now gives you that visibility all the way to the nth party once you've connected with the suppliers and have built out this map. So again, the map can identify these concentration risks. And again, that's concentration risks to be discussed, whether they're new or previously known. They're at least information that you now have to make informed decision making. From a collaboration perspective, we have communities on the platform where, depending on the community, the respective entities, and that's we have communities, various government entities, public sector bodies, other sort of private sector organizations, CNI, and so forth. These members have chosen to get on the platform and share their supply chain maps with each other. And so that sort of leads into multiple benefits. One, by overlaying everyone's supply chain maps together, you now see the entire supply chain of an entire sector and can really identify where additional systemic risks now occur, where if a particular critical supplier is used by the majority of participants, again, that might be a risk that they're aware of. But perhaps what they're not aware of is at the fourth or fifth party level, that maybe a small mom and pop shop is providing a critical service for this third party. And so that begins the conversation as to together, holistically, how can they approach this supplier? How can they improve their controls? Or perhaps they need to have conversations with the third party to determine you have a risk, you need to address this, or maybe we need to think about how we diversify. At the same time, this collaboration allows people to kind of work together, raise risks, collaborate, communicate with each other on issues that they're having with their suppliers. They can share best practices in terms of the controls that they're implementing within their organizations, what they're asking of their suppliers. And it just fosters communication, it fosters collaboration, and you're getting to this point where now you're seeing everyone else's TPRM teams as an extension of yours. And that really is a force multiplier, being able to not only get a better handle of the concentration risks that are out there, but improving the maturity of the suppliers within your supply chain, and hopefully having that proactive conversation with them to bolster their maturity or give them the evidence or proof that they need to justify additional efforts to for maybe perhaps controls that they were looking to improve anyway.
And were there any specific takeaways for the audience or things they were going to think differently about? I mean, you've mentioned things about the getting ahead versus sort of waiting for the regulator, and you talked about there might be dependencies people haven't thought about, and that mix between collaboration and coordination. So, were there sort of common themes you felt people were walking away thinking, "This is what I'm going to do," or take away from the session?
Yeah, I think. Well, I'll caveat that with what was great to hear was a general consensus of the security sort of mindset of assume breach. Right, we've seen that over the last 20 years, right, from firewalls that only specifically identified the bad guys to now we're getting to sort of assumed breach, right? And which is great, right? From a resilience perspective, you always want to assume that you are um, hackers can get in. How do you sort of mitigate the blast radius, and how do you ensure that your key business functions are being able to be restored and can operate? So given that, I think there's still a sort of sense of, okay, well, if we assume breach all the time, what are we going to get from collaboration? And I think sort of really sort of driving the key point that that collaboration aspect gives you resilience beyond compliance, where you're really looking ahead, a couple steps ahead, to shed a light on new and emerging threats, risks that perhaps you hadn't identified before. And I think, from my perspective, I think that was one of the key takeaways. Where I think there was a way to sort of look at collaboration differently beyond just what we share, perhaps through specific legislation. Again, DORA sort of improves this, but as everyone agreed or recognized, information sharing is not mandatory. It's an ideal. It's a best practice, and so getting folks to think about, well, how do we think of that as really a best practice? And collaboration is truly a way forward to do that.
Okay, Justin, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Simon. Good talking to you.